As we've been in this series in the book of First John, one of the things that we've been exploring is there's a season in the Christian calendar called Easter Tide. Easter Tide is the season after the resurrection, where in light of whatever we might be experiencing in the world, the pain, the difficulty, and the trauma, and even especially for us as New Yorkers and really this global pandemic that has ravaged around the world, that together we are supposed to be an Easter people living in a Good Friday world, that together we live in light of the resurrection. And what does that mean for us? And so John, who's one of the eyewitnesses to Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, he actually writes this letter, and he writes about what does it mean to have this life with God. And last week, the message was about light and darkness, because John, he basically presents these themes to us about what does it mean to have witnessed and to embody who the living Jesus is all about. And he talks about light and darkness. And one of the extraordinary things that John says is basically to walk in the light or to be with God, all it requires is that we have an honesty about the fact that we're not perfect people, that we actually sin. I mean, isn't that crazy? I mean, it's the most inclusive message of God to us, that all we have to do is actually just be willing to confess that we're not perfect. And meanwhile, the people that are in darkness are the people who don't confess that they're imperfect. In fact, they're the people who think that they're self-righteous. And what's crazy about that is that whether you're religious or you're not, that pride that seeps into every single one of us as human beings at times often keeps us in darkness because we're unwilling to admit when we make mistakes, when we sin, that we have gone far off from not only what we desired, but what God has desired for us. And so John actually continues in this theme of what does faith look like? What is life with God like? So check this out, this is what he says. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. So do you get that? He's basically saying that if you actually obey his words, if it's not only something that penetrates your mind and your heart, but it actually manifests in behaviors and obedience, this is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one which we've had since the beginning. This old command is the message you have heard, yet I am writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. Now, here's what John is basically saying, because remember, he's using the metaphor of light and darkness. He's basically saying, if you want to talk about what faith is about, it's actually one that obedience comes along with trusting. In other words, I might say all day long, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus. I want to live in his ways according to his love, justice, and mercy. But if it doesn't flesh out in the way that I live my life, then perhaps I'm not really in the light. Now, see, this theme is actually brought up by other eyewitnesses of Jesus. So for instance, in the book of James, written by the brother of Jesus, check out what James writes, who is one of the leaders in the early church, who also witnessed the resurrected Jesus. So if you can imagine, James, who grew up with Jesus, is also calling Jesus Lord and Savior, believes in his resurrection. Now, check out what he writes about what faith is like. He says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? As a church, we could put out social media feeds denouncing racism and sexism and violence and working on behalf of the poor and the marginalized. But at the end of the day, what good is it if our money, our time, our energy is not really supporting what we say we care about? Look at what James says. In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe, and they shudder. See, what James, the brother of Jesus, as well as John, the eyewitness disciple of Jesus, what they're both saying is this about faith, that the essence of faith is that faith actually works. If you can go to the next slide. The essence of faith is actually that faith works. and a faith that is demonstrating itself in the way it lives its life. Now, there's another word that I'd like to use to describe what faith in Jesus might look like. It's this word. It's the word integrity. Integrity. Now, the word integrity actually comes from the Latin word integer. Integer, of course, we know, means this word for a whole number. Integer meaning wholeness, not fractured or fractions of, but something that's whole. Now, you might not be a Christian here today, and maybe you tuned in today for whatever reason, and you might say, the people who seem the most unwhole, or the people who say something and yet their behaviors are different, are Christians. And maybe it's brought you a lot of confusion. Or maybe you've been a Christian for a while, and maybe what you've experienced of Christians has been this departure from integrity. It's people who like to talk a whole big game, and yet their behaviors look very different than the Jesus that we read about in scriptures. What's interesting, again, whether it's James, who's an eyewitness, whether it's John, who's an eyewitness, whether it's Jesus himself, one of the constant themes of the Christian message has always been about this word, integrity or wholeness. Here's what John Ortberg, an author, writes about the soul. This is what he says. Your soul is what integrates your will, your intentions, your mind, your thoughts and feelings, your values and conscience, and your body, your face, your body language, and your actions into a single life. A soul is healthy or well-ordered when there's harmony between these three entities and God's intent for all creation. When you are connected with God and other people in life, you have a healthy soul. It's integrated. It's whole. Check out what he writes here as he further kind of talks about soul. The soul integrates the will and the mind and the body. Sin disintegrates them. In sin, my appetite for lust or anger or superiority dominates my will. My will, which was made to rule my body, becomes enslaved to what my body wants. When I flatter other people, I learn to use my mouth and my face to conceal my true thoughts and intentions. I'm guilty of that. This also requires energy. I'm disintegrating my body from my mind. I hate, but I can't admit it even to myself. So I just distort my perception of reality to rationalize my hatred. I disintegrate my thoughts from the reality. Sin ultimately makes long-term gratitude or friendship or meaning impossible. Sin eventually destroys my capacity even for enjoyment, let alone meaning. It distorts my perceptions, alienates my relationships, inflames my desires, and enslaves my will. This is what it means to lose your soul or to lose integrity. What happens is I become disintegrated. I mean, you've probably kind of experienced this yourself, whether you're religious or you're not, how all of these things, my mind, my body, my will, all of these things work in tandem. The craziest thing is that when I was in the early years of being a pastor, so a professional clergyman, I felt so much pressure to not share about when I struggled or when I was doubting or when I was hurting. And for whatever reason, I felt this pressure to be someone who was superhuman, someone who didn't feel, someone who could put on a smile and be kind and compassionate at all times. And yet, meanwhile, I was suffering from a depression of the loss of relationships. And when I was going through that season, I remember no one around me knew what was happening. And yet at night, I could not sleep. I was staying up really late, eating all sorts of food late at night. It's interesting how that happens, isn't it? How when I'm playing this charade, acting a certain way, and yet it's not integrated with all of me, even the dark parts of me. There are times where all of it works together. And so as a result, that depression led to sleepless nights, led to eating really unhealthily during the evenings and throughout. And so what's interesting is that even now, Tina, she'll notice that if I'm anxious about something, she'll notice I've got these go-to snacks that I go to late at night. And she'll just comment, she'll say like, hey, is everything okay? She knows immediately because this habit that's been formed when I'm feeling anxious or afraid or even frustrated or overwhelmed. She knows my go-to behaviors that kind of manifest when something is happening deep within my soul. But see, we've all experienced this, haven't we? We've experienced these moments of disintegration, these moments where we might say one thing with our lips, and yet our behavior is very different. Dallas Willard, he writes in his book, The Divine Conspiracy, and I've used this example before because I think this was so apt. He was a philosophy professor, and one of the things that he noticed was one of his students was acing his ethics class, knew all about the history of ethics and the philosophies behind it, and how ethics, as basically a school of thought, was practiced in different civil societies. And so one of the things, though, that he discovered and found out from other classmates was this person who was acing every single exam on ethics was actually highly unethical, especially in the way that he was treating women. And he talks about that disintegration that we have in today's society, where people can talk about one thing and yet their behavior is far different. And see, what John is talking about and what James is talking about, what Jesus was always about, was this integration, that together we're supposed to integrate and keep things whole. So one specific example then that First John talks about is this. Check out what he writes. He says, anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there's nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. Now, this word of hate and love, one of the things that Jesus talks about is hate goes much deeper than simply the behaviors, but it also goes into the deepest kind of manifestations of the heart. Again, Jesus is talking about this integration of everything, mind, body, soul. And so here's one example that John is basically saying. You can say all day long that you are loving, or even in this kind of season of justice and the outcry that's come from marginalized communities. We can say it all day. The question is, has whatever we say with our lips, has it translated to our hands and to our feet? Are we a people that when it comes to the tangible stuff, our money, our time, our energy, that it really demonstrates that we're about the things that Jesus cares about? Things like love and beauty and justice and forgiveness and truth. The easiest thing is to post things on social media and to say, this is what we're for. The harder thing is to actually have that love take on flesh and for it to show up in our pocketbook or in our timelines or in our energy and in the ways that we actually treat people around us. Richard Rohr, who's this Franciscan priest, one of the things that he talks about is he says, the best critique of the bad is a practice of the better. In today's socially conscious world, it's easiest to make a statement. It's harder to actually practice the better. What does it mean for us to be a community that actually practices the better? That there's an integration behind what we say and what we practice. Now, some of you might be like, oh, this is so guilt-driven. Like, why are you laying this on us thick? Well, I want you to know, as I've been pondering this passage myself, I myself have been wrestling with all of the inconsistencies of my own life. The ways I can talk about humble sacrifice, and yet my life doesn't demonstrate humble sacrifice in my marriage. All the ways that I can talk about being joyful in affliction and looking and longing for hopefulness, and yet I can be someone who broods and is not able to kind of remain present and holding together all the difficult emotions. Instead, I just go to sheer darkness. There are all these ways in which I myself can be disintegrated. And so as I preach this message, let me be the first one to admit that oftentimes I'm so far from the heart of God that's been outlined. You know what's interesting, though, is that in the Hebraic mind, so even before Jesus came on the scene, There was an understanding that all of these things were integrated, that our mind, our heart, our will, that the soul, this soul that we kept, that all of it worked together and was integrated, and that sin, and the word that was used often to describe integration or wholeness was the word shalom, otherwise known as peace. Shalom was this idea that things were integrated and we lived with integrity. And yet when there was a disruption of that shalom, when sin comes in, it disintegrates, it rips apart. And then we begin to hate and walk in darkness. We begin to walk in pride and not being willing to admit our own weakness and suffering. And in so doing, we become far from the heart of God. You see, the ancient Hebrew mind, even before Jesus came on the scene, knew that the way of God was to live in this integration. Now, that's why John writes the following in the passage that was read earlier. He writes this, "Dear friends, I am not writing you a new command, but an old one." Now, why does he say old one? Because again, everyone understood that the essence of faith is a faith that works. They did not think that one can just use fluff words and claim something. They knew that the essence of faith was a faith that works. And this is why he says, I'm not giving you a new command, but an old one, which you have had since the beginning. This old command is a message you have heard. But notice what John writes here. He says, yet I'm writing you a new command. Huh? A new command? Wait a minute, Drew, you're talking about integration. What's this new command that you're talking about? Look at what John writes about what this new command is. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. You see, here's what John is basically saying. What he's saying is the new command is God himself will embody and take on human flesh and incarnate into the world and come into the world and bear all of the human limitations that you and I experience human life itself, the highs and the lows, the panoply of emotions, the tragic moments, the tears, the suffering, the death, that Jesus himself would come. Jesus would come himself and live the life that we should live, but do so in such a way as to show this integration, a way of authenticity, a way of living into this manner. And the beauty of the Christian journey is that Jesus would walk this life for us so that we don't have to be perfect, so that we can simply admit to him, Jesus, you have shown us the way, and we can't measure up. And we confess our sins, as John talks about earlier. And you have shown us, though, that you ultimately died on the cross to bear our shame, to suffer the most disintegrating experience of separation from God the Father. And you might do this because you love us. And now you have welcomed us into a life and into a joy and into a journey where we actually get to mimic you, where we actually get to be like you. You know, in the early church, actually in the book of Acts, which is the history of the early church, the first time this word is used, it's the word Christians. And the word Christians, essentially what it means is basically followers of Christ. Christ and Christians. That this is who we're called to be. A people that don't live according to a moral code, although there is morality involved in Christian faith. A people who don't just believe in some philosophical ideal, although there is some philosophy in the Christian doctrinal system, but to actually be a people who follow the way of someone who has lived and died on our behalf, experienced joy, love, and modeled a way of kindness, of honesty, of authenticity, of courage. And the way of Jesus actually invites us to be Christians, Christians who emulate Christ, who walk in his ways, who are integrated the way Jesus was, not because we're so great, but because he's so great. One of the early Christians in the 5th century was a man named St. Patrick. And Patrick was a missionary to Ireland. And he has this beautiful saying, which you can see on your screen. And it's a saying that I would like to invite you as we close today. I'd like for us to all read this together, and all of us will be muted. But what it means to be a Christian, first, I want to say this. For any of you who've been deeply disappointed by Christians, maybe you've been deeply disappointed by me as the pastor of this church, I just want you to know, like, I'm sorry if I have in any way dishonored the central heart of Jesus when I've made whatever we're doing as a church anything but be about following Jesus. Maybe you've been disappointed by others. Maybe it's a loved one. Maybe it's someone in your family. Maybe it's by someone in the church. I don't know. But I want to bring us back to the very heart of what this has always been about. The new commandment that John gives is basically found in Jesus, that we are to be in him. And so today, I thought we would end with this prayer and this confession by reading this poem to bring us back, to center us again in the reason that we've all perhaps been longing for, to be connected to the God of the universe, to experience his divine presence and transcendence, and to be a people who find our purpose and mission in the world because of him. And if we can just kind of extract all the fluff that disintegrates us from the very heart of this message, I think we'd all be better off. So, will you read with me this poem? Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me.